Have you ever doubted yourself? Have you ever really deep down wondered if you are good enough as a partner, good enough at your job, just good enough generally? The way you answer those questions say a lot about the way you look at yourself. Essentially, your self-esteem. And as Ayn Rand identified in this gorgeous quote here that you've all heard a million times, I'm sure, it's really important as well for love. And not just romantic love, but love with family members, with friends, loving your job, your life, all of that. So dozens of books can and have been written on self-esteem. I won't be able to get to everything one could possibly say today, but I want to talk about some of the most important things about what self-esteem is, what it has to do with love, how we can improve it, and some of the common errors that you see people make. So, as I said, Ayn Rand identified, of course, one of the relationships between self-esteem and love, which is that if you don't have a strong self-esteem, you really cannot genuinely, deeply love anyone or anything. She put it as only a rationally selfish man, or woman, a man of self-esteem is capable of love, because he is the only man capable of holding firm, consistent, uncompromising, unbetrayed values. Isn't that the kind of love we all want to have? The man who does not value himself cannot value anyone or anything. And there's an important part here. In holding firm, consistent values and not betraying them ever, you have to know what your values are. You have to understand them. You have to trust them. And you have to be able to recognize them when you see them in other people, in other things that you might like to do, in ways that you could live your life. So first step, you have to know your values, and then you have to be able to trust them and know that they are legitimate, rational values that are going to support your life, that make sense given the world and the context that you live in. Now, I won't spend too much time on this part of the equation because this is Martin's talk, but love is a trade. But it's not a trade like when you go to the store and buy a cup of coffee. We're not paying people, obviously, for this. With love, romantic love or friendship, you are giving values and you're getting values in return. But give and take is not quite the perfect analogy because it should be mutually beneficial. If it's a good, healthy relationship, you're both walking away with more, which is how trade works generally, actually. But there's a problem, though. If you come to a relationship with very low self-esteem, what you're actually bringing to the table, along with your other great qualities and values, is a whole bunch of unfulfilled needs. And then you're not being the balanced half of this equation. And your relationships are all going to be a lot harder. We're going to talk about some more reasons why that's true as well. One of them is that when your self-esteem is very low, you're looking for it from other sources, and particularly from other people. And so other people become not full, entire, complicated human beings, but just sources of approval or disapproval. People who say, I like you, or I don't like you, or you're bad, or you're good. And that means that we cannot appreciate other people, and that you're not looking for somebody you can respect and admire and enjoy their qualities and their company. You're looking for people who are going to not condemn you, or maybe even, if you're lucky, be a little bit impressed by you. This is not a recipe for love or for happiness. Before we go any further in talking about self-esteem, I want to put a definition on the table here. This isn't word for word from anywhere. I've kind of synthesized Ayn Rand's definition and the objectivist psychologist Nathaniel Branden's, but both of them have these two aspects which I think are together basically make up what we're talking about when we say self-esteem. Firstly is efficacy, knowing that you are able to deal with the world. You're able to think and to think well and to act on your judgment, and that's going to work out for you. And the second part is self-worth, knowing that you're worthy of being successful, of being happy, of being loved. One really important aspect of self-esteem, though, that I think isn't fully appreciated is the way in which it is self-reinforcing. Whether it's good or bad, if you have good self-esteem, that's going to cause good outcomes. So to be more specific. Say you have good self-esteem. In your work, what is that going to look like? You're going to set high goals. You're going to go for those goals with everything you have because you believe that if you do, you can achieve them. And most of the time, you will be right. Because if you set high and appropriate goals and you work hard at them, you're likely to succeed. And then that's going to boost your self-esteem further because look at that, I succeeded. You have evidence that you are good at what you do. On the relationship side, if you have good self-esteem, you're not going to accept people treating you badly. This is not obviously being disappointed if you do something wrong, but being abusive, being horribly mean and nasty, and those kinds of things. If you have good self-esteem, you're simply not going to put up with that. That's what's often called setting boundaries. And then, if you only accept appropriate and respectful treatment, you're going to have healthier relationships. And guess what? That's also good for your self-esteem. And so we have this cycle that continues. Now, on the flip side, if we have bad self-esteem, oh, that's right there. If you have bad self-esteem at work, that may look like you not really trying. And this can take a number of different forms, right? You might be going through the motions, but not really believing you're going to succeed, so you're not trying that hard. Or maybe you're not setting very high goals to begin with, because if you only set low goals, then you can achieve them. Or it can also look like being afraid of failure, being afraid of condemnation, being afraid of the facts about yourself that you're not really willing to look at, or facts about the world you're not really willing to look at. And that is obviously also not going to help you to succeed. So not always, but more often, if you're not trying, if you're not thinking things through, if you're not giving it your best effort, you're more likely to fail. And then when you fail, that lowers your self-esteem because you failed, and you sort of think to yourself, well, I knew I couldn't do it. Obviously, I'm no good at this. When it comes to relationships, if you don't believe that you are worthy of being loved, if you don't believe that you're fundamentally good, then you're going to accept people treating you however they happen to treat you. There was the line from a movie I watched ages ago. I don't remember pretty much anything else about the movie, but I remember the line, "We accept the love we think we deserve." Because yes, perks of being a wallflower, somebody said it, thank you. And that leads to, obviously, toxic relationships. Sometimes even, in extreme cases, abusive relationships. And those aren't good for your self-esteem either, because you start to feel like, maybe I deserve to be treated this way, even though you probably don't. Now, one caveat here is that sometimes people have one side and not the other, and this is a spectrum, right? People are not usually all the way, having great self-esteem or all the way having bad self-esteem. You're usually somewhere in between, and it can be different in different parts of your life. Another aspect of that can actually be associated with bad self-esteem with your work is being a perfectionist, where you think that if I don't do everything perfectly, then nobody will like me and I'm not good at my job. And so you drive yourself to work really hard and you produce some really great work, but you're not able to really enjoy it. So you might succeed, but not have the emotional benefits of succeeding. You're cheating yourself, really, in that situation, but that can happen. I wanted to hone in a little bit more on that being motivated by fear and what that looks like and how that helps you to not, well, doesn't help you, it makes you not succeed. One author put it this way: a person who doubts himself is like a man who would enlist in the ranks of his enemies and bear arms against himself. He makes his failure certain by himself being the first person to be convinced of it. Now, a personal example, I for many years danced ballet, and what you have here is a pointe shoe. Now, I gotta put this down. Okay, so most of the time when you're walking around in your day-to-day life, your foot is flat on the ground. Sometimes you go up a little bit onto your tippy toes, like that. When you're on pointe shoes, you're all the way over the top of your foot. But a lot of times, when I started being on pointe, when the girls I used to dance with and teach started to be on pointe, it's scary because you're having to put your weight somewhere it's never been before. And so a lot of people, being too afraid of falling when they do that, don't put their weight up far enough. They don't get onto the flat part of the shoe. Instead, they get onto this little bitty edge here, which is both slippery and very small. And so if your weight is on that slippery little tiny strip, you're almost certainly going to fall. And I saw that happen a lot of times. It happened to me a couple of times. It was because we were afraid that we failed. And this plays out, in real life in any number of situations. we talked about some of them with work kind of before. But the point is that if you're being driven by fear of failure, by fear of falling, you're actually making that more likely. Another interesting aspect of this, though, is that we don't stay the same throughout our entire lives, right? Most of the time, hopefully. We grow, we learn, we change, we do new things. And so the way we look at ourselves when we start to do those new things has to change as well. Otherwise, we start to self-sabotage. So if you begin to do things you've never done before, instead of being this, cute little lion cub looking at themselves as a lion, you may be the other way around. You may be an adult or a teenage lion looking at yourself as a cub still. If you don't really think that you're up to the task, then you're going to, not necessarily, this isn't predetermined, but you're more likely to act in ways that you think are appropriate to how you used to be. And that ends up being self-sabotaging. So for example, I told you guys all I used to dance. And when I was a teenager, I started to teach dance. And that was a little bit daunting for me because these people who had been my peers, and in some cases were older than I was like 16 or something, and there were people in my classes who were in their 30s, their 40s. And I'm sitting there like, how am I going to teach these people? This is terrifying. I've never done this before. I'm not a teacher. But I was a teacher, and I had to learn how to be a teacher, and I had to learn to think of myself as a teacher. I had to adjust. If I hadn't made that adjustment, then, for example, I might not have prepared properly for my lessons, or I might not have continued to grow as a dancer so that I could be a better teacher. Those types of things would have been the self-sabotaging behavior that I'm describing here. So to wrap up this part here, what I'm trying to say is that self-esteem creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, but you're still in control. You can rewrite that prophecy, and we're going to talk about how momentarily. One way that you do not do it is the sort of pop psychology way of just telling yourself you're great. Looking in the mirror and blowing yourself kisses or saying that you're laughing, but you see this advice online, don't you? Just tell yourself you're great, and eventually you'll start to believe it. But that is completely cheating yourself. Because you're not connecting the way you look at yourself to reality, you're not connecting it to morality, you're not connecting it to responsibility, or to anything very important. And moreover, if you're sitting there telling yourself that you're fantastic at everything you do, if you're not, you're lying to yourself. And if you're lying to yourself, what are you teaching your subconscious? That you can't trust yourself because your thoughts aren't in line with reality. So not only does this not work, it actually makes it worse. The first step that we have to actually take if we want to really deeply build our self-esteem from the ground up is to begin to accept ourselves. And that means accepting what sounds really basic. You have a right to exist. But think about that and all of its implications. Think about what that really means. That you have a right to exist as you are. And more importantly, you have a right to exist for yourself and not for other people. And now, accepting yourself does not mean you have to like everything about yourself. Obviously, that is the goal eventually, but you don't have to start there. If there are things about yourself that you don't like, things you struggle with, things you're not good at, it's perfectly normal. But you have to first accept that they are part of you before you can begin to improve them or, well, really to improve them, to figure out where they're coming from, etc. What we're not trying to do here is to prove to yourself that you're enough. If my aim is to prove I'm enough, the project goes on to infinity because the battle was already lost on the day I conceded the issue was debatable, in the words of Nathaniel Branden. You are of value. Now, saying I'm enough, a quick caveat here, does not mean I am perfect and I have nowhere to grow. It means I'm of value. And chances are you are of value. You'd have to be a really, really horrible person to not possess any good qualities, to not have any skills or talents or any redeeming values at all. If you are a normal human being, you've done something in your life, probably many somethings. That's good. you have achieved something, you've learned something, you've formed some good relationship, you've created something. You don't have to start a business or win the Olympics to be of value, to have created value, to be worthwhile. I mean, great if you do, don't let me stop you, but that's not what we're talking about here. Yeah. So how do we begin to do this if you're at the stage where you're really struggling to even accept the various parts of yourself? First, look at the different parts of you. Think about them, write about them if you want to. Talk to another person. But your emotions, your desires, the way you look, all of these things are the things that we're aiming to accept. Now remember, accept does not mean liking at first. You don't have to like where you're at. But you are where you are, and acknowledging that is tying your mind to reality. And then you want to start compassionately asking questions. I say compassionately because the goal here is not to berate yourself or to be mean to yourself. That's not helpful, right? Even if you've done something wrong or bad, even if you've made a mistake, even if it's a very big mistake, sitting there and trying to make yourself feel bad about it, or not even trying, usually it comes pretty naturally, making yourself feel bad about it is not going to help. What you want to do is talk as though to a close friend or somebody you really care about with yourself and figure out what's going on here. If I don't like something, why don't I like it? If I made a mistake, why did I make it? But in a gentle, straightforward way. A personal example I'll use, is that last year I had to have a moment of coming to accept the way that I looked at the time, which I wasn't terribly happy with. I accepted it, I didn't like it, and I set about taking the steps I needed to fix it, which is losing weight, and I've lost about 20 pounds since then. So, basic example, but if I had not taken that first step of saying, this is where I am now, this is not really where I want to be, then I couldn't have taken the steps to fix it. Obviously, it seems very basic, but I find that nutrition analogies are really helpful because it's more clear-cut, but it works the same way in all kinds of other areas. And it's also really important. Your physical health matters a lot. So to move forward, you have to accept where you are. Basic principle there. This is a big section, so one sec. Okay. The bigger part that I think a lot of people struggle with or don't have the right ideas for, but everybody in this room already has some great principles to help you with, is being moral by your own standards, firstly, because if you're trying to judge yourself by other people's standards, it'll never work. You'll never truly believe that conclusion. But also by rational standards, because if your standards of morality are not actually practical, if you can't actually achieve them, or if they're actively bad for your life, then you're setting what you need for your self-esteem, which is to believe that you're moral, against what you need for your life. And that battle is going to tear you apart. And I've seen it happen with people I've talked to and cared about. So you need to have rational standards. You need to know that those are tied to reality and to act by them. So if you consider, for example, as a contrast, altruism. Altruism requires that you sacrifice the things that you value to things that you do not value. And if you sacrifice the things that you value, you cannot live and thrive. But if that's your standard of morality, that's what you need to have good self-esteem. And so you see how these sorts of requirements are going to work against the things that you need. Oh, all right, well, we're going there next anyway. So I wanted to be a little bit more specific and talk about the objectivist virtues, and as we go through, I'm going to try to make clear how practicing these virtues will be good for your self-esteem and for your life generally. The two go hand in hand if we're using a rational standard. So rationality means keeping your mind focused on reality. Why is that important? Because that is where we live. If we do not keep our minds tied to reality, if we don't use rational standards of thinking, then we cannot make good decisions for our lives. And because we are rational animals, fundamentally, if we cannot use our minds and trust the conclusions that we're coming to, then we do not feel like we're able to deal with the world, because that is our way of dealing with the world, is by using our minds. And so then we've lost the first half of self-esteem right there, efficacy. If we are not able to trust our minds, if they're not tied to reality, then we're lost, essentially. And there are a lot of ideas in the world that would undermine this. They fall under the broad heading of mysticism. But just to take it sort of in broad brushstrokes here, consider if you think that there is a God out there, and you don't really, set aside for a moment what the God is like. I'm not interested. Whether it's a nice God, a vengeful God, the point is that there's something there that you cannot verify by means of using your mind and observation, by looking at the world, then there is a being out there that could do whatever they want, and you can never fully understand the world, and you can never fully act to support your life in the best way possible because there's always this deity that could come and undermine it. And so your actions don't actually have to match up to the world. So you can see how that is really destructive to self-esteem. And I had another point here. I was going to give an example. So consider, for example, if you're a student. I think there are a fair few students here today. And you have the choice on a Friday night between going to a friend's birthday party, and just to keep the example easy, let's say this isn't a terribly close friend of yours. It's someone you like, but they're not your best friend. Or studying for a really important exam. And so you sit down and you rationally weigh your values and you say, I'm going to stay and study for the exam. And in addition to using reason, hopefully, to study for your exam, you have made a rational choice there. And then let's say because you studied all weekend for your exam, you do a great job. You've used your reason to come to a good conclusion, and that has worked out for you in your academic career. So you can see how this would sort of start to build as you're going through your life. If you continue to use your mind to focus on the world and to make good decisions in reality, then your life goes better and you continue to trust the things that or the conclusions that you're coming to as you are going throughout your life. So this begins to build your sense of efficacy. This begins to build your life overall. Independence. I think a few of you were here last year when I spoke about independence, but it's about producing enough to support yourself, but it's more importantly about coming to your own conclusions. And this completely sets you free in terms of being able to trust your mind, because if you've come to your own conclusion and you're right, your conclusion matches up with reality, excellent. You can trust your mind, wonderful. If you realize that you're wrong, you can correct it. You're still great, it's fine. There's no problem here, because if you have all of the thinking that went into making the decision, you can see where you went wrong. For a sort of weak analogy, consider like doing a complicated math problem on a piece of paper, right? If you have all of the steps, you can see where you went wrong, and you cannot make that mistake in the future. Every conclusion you come to, anytime you test it against the world, is an opportunity for you, either to build your trust in your mind or to reconnect your mind to reality. And you see, actually, in studies that people who have high self-esteem don't mind being corrected. Because if they're wrong, now they've learned. And they can actually have their minds be closer to reality by having that correction. Integrity I won't spend too long talking about because this is Isidora's topic, but I think integrity means, just very briefly, having rational values and acting accordingly. If you are not acting in accordance with the things that you have decided are important, whether this is a prioritization of your life or whether this is moral values, then you're not going to think that you are managing your life very well, or you might not even think that you are moral. And so that is obviously going to be destructive to your efficacy and your sense of self-worth. Justice. Justice in the objectivist sense is never seeking or granting the unearned. And this is important. As Rand put it, a man of self-esteem does not even want the unearned, because you know you can earn or work for or build the things that you want and need. And there's a sense of pride that comes from doing that. So if the choice is between having it handed to you and working for it, if you're having it handed to you, you're cheating yourself, because you don't have that opportunity to learn and to grow and to have the pride of knowing I worked for that. This ties in really well with the virtue of productiveness, and which is producing value, supporting your life. My lovely husband will be talking to you guys more about that later this week. But there are a couple of aspects here. The first one I want to talk about is, again, that pride of having built something. Montessori classrooms, for example. The guides are trained. They don't call them teachers in Montessori, they call them guides. The guides are trained to not intervene when a child is trying to solve a problem. And I think if you think about this, you can see why that is. Have you ever been trying to remember something or trying to figure something out, trying to solve something, and you're almost there, and then somebody swoops in and does it for you? You're trying to remember a word, and then somebody tells you? Exactly. It's like that frustrating sense of loss of you almost had it. And that's what they don't want to take away from the kids. And in doing that, these kids build great senses of self-esteem because every day, all day long, they're solving problems, they're figuring things out, and they're building their sense of self-esteem by being productive. The other aspect of it that I think is helpful for self-esteem is just being productive is an opportunity to build things you love, things you care about. And this doesn't have to be physically, although if you're an artist or something, maybe it is. But if you're building an organization or writing an article or whatever kind of work it is that you do, and you're building something that you love, I can't think of a better way to boost your self-worth and your self-esteem than by being able to say, I made this incredible, wonderful thing. Honesty. Now again, honesty, I'll remind that you have the objectivist definition here is not faking reality. It's not just not telling lies, although most importantly, it's not telling lies to yourself. But it's not faking reality and taking into account the entire context of the situation. And so again, here you see, we're focusing on how the world is and working with it as it is. If we're trying to change things, pretend that things are other than they are, it's not going to work for you. And I think it will not be surprising to you guys that if you're not honest, if you're habitually dishonest, that's very bad for your relationships. But it's also very bad for your physical health. Your body does not like having to deal with the stress of being dishonest. There's a great quote here from Thomas Jefferson as well to highlight the importance of this. Nothing is so mistaken as the supposition that a person is to extricate, just means pull yourself out of, himself from a difficulty by intrigue, by chicanery means deception, by dissimulation, by trimming, by an untruth, by an injustice. Basically, anytime you try to solve a problem by being dishonest, you're just going to make it worse. You're going to end up in a web of lies that is even harder, and it also matters if you're lying to yourself. In fact, I would say it matters even more if you're trying to hide truths from yourself. And finally, pride. I have a crown here because Aristotle referred to pride as the crown of all of the virtues. Now, before I explain that, I should say there are a couple of senses in which we could talk about pride. There's pride as an emotion, which is a response to an achievement or to success, and that, I think, supports self-esteem, but it is not as fundamental as self-esteem. Because self-esteem is not just, I'm good at this one thing, or I have achieved this one thing. It is, I am good overall. I am able to deal with the world overall. So it's deeper than that. But they're related. They support each other. Now, as a virtue, Aristotle called pride the crown of the virtues because you had to have all of the other ones first. You have to know that you are good, that you are rational, that you are independent, that you have integrity before you can be proud of all of that. And Rand put it as one must earn the right to hold oneself as one's own highest value by achieving one's own moral perfection. And by moral perfection here, she didn't mean that you have to know everything. That's impossible. She didn't mean that you had to be able to do everything. That's also impossible. What she meant is by acting in accordance with reality to the best of your ability all of the time, and if you've made a mistake, don't leave it uncorrected. If you know there's a problem with your character, something that you tend to be bad at, not leaving that uncorrected. That is how you achieve what is actually possible in terms of moral perfection. So, conclusion here of this section, knowing that you are moral is essential for self-esteem. If you do not think that you are worthy of success and happiness, if you do not think that you are morally good, then you will not be able to think that you are a good person overall, that you are worthy of success and happiness. There are a couple of other important aspects that tie into a lot of the virtues, I think, but that are important enough I want to focus on them individually. The first is responsibility, and taking responsibility for your choices, for your actions, for achieving your values, for your goals. The way Ayn Rand put it is that as man is a being of self-made wealth, so he is a being of self-made soul. You make who you are with everything that you do. And appreciating that in its fullness and all of its implications is the best way I know of to really take seriously building a good character and going after the things that you care about, whether this is people, hobbies, your job, all of these things ideally, but that is how you go about feeling that you have control over your life. Now, of course, there are actually some things that you don't have control over, and that's also part of it. Knowing what you don't have control over, for example, if you live in a tyrannical regime, or if there's a natural disaster, you have to accept genuinely that you do not have control over it. Otherwise, that will begin to hurt your self-esteem in a way that is unwarranted, because you could not have done anything. But what that sense of guilt is doing there is giving you the illusion of efficacy, saying, well, maybe if I could have just done this one thing, things would have been different. But if it was something you genuinely could not have controlled at all, you couldn't have. And trying to build this sort of smoke screen of an efficacy that you don't actually have is also going to hurt your self-esteem, and in this case, unfairly. Acting with purpose is another thing that really is useful to your self-esteem. If you have goals, if you go after them, if you have goals that you've chosen rationally that fit with your life and your values, and then you go after them with everything you have, you are building your sense of efficacy and worth with every goal that you choose and everything that you go after. If you are working towards your goals, you know that the things you are doing are worthwhile because you're going for the things that you rationally value. And obviously this ties in, of course, with, I keep using the word rational, so rationality, as well as productiveness. So to conclude this section, to improve your self-esteem, we first have to accept yourself, even if that does not necessarily mean liking everything about yourself right this very minute. It means being morally good by a rational standard. And if you are morally good by a rational standard and you fully accept that standard, then you know that you're morally good. And that is, if you just kind of think that maybe you are, that's not really enough. It's taking responsibility for your life and for your actions, but not for the things that you cannot control. Because holding yourself to an impossible standard is a recipe for failure. And it's acting with purpose, knowing that the things you're doing are supporting something that matters. So next I want to talk about some of the mistakes that you can make when you are dealing with self-esteem. And the mistakes I've chosen are ones that I think are very common, but I would definitely like to stress that this is not an exhaustive list, and since I've made this list, I've thought of at least 3 more. So if you want to talk about those later, we can. But the first one is the biggest mistake I made with my own self-esteem, which is relying on other people, relying on external validation. And the personal example for me was when I was growing up, I considered myself a fairly smart person. I remember things easily, I still do. I did well in school, I read all the time, so I had a pretty good vocabulary and pretty good reading comprehension. But then when I was, I think it was 15 or 16, I started dating this guy who, in retrospect, did not have great self-esteem. And he had this tendency to sort of make fun of me or berate me a bit if he knew something I didn't. And that started to, it was never anything, a lot all at one time. It was just little comments here and there, little jokes that weren't really jokes. And after a while, that started to really wear down my self-esteem. And I started to sort of question, maybe I'm not actually that smart. Maybe I'm not actually, and I just kind of got through school, by being lucky. And then I got out of that relationship and realized that actually he's the one who doesn't think he's that smart and has to make himself feel better by putting other people down. And when I was sort of rebuilding my self-esteem in the years after that relationship, one of the key things I came to realize is that my qualities are what they are because of how I act regardless of whether or not anybody else sees them. I used a really loose analogy at the time, which was like to a diamond. A diamond has the qualities that it has, right? It's a certain level of clarity, it's like a certain amount of sparkly. There's a proper term for that, I'm sure, but we'll go with sparkly. It's a certain level of hard. And whether anybody is there or not to pay thousands of dollars for this diamond, it still has those qualities. Now, all analogies break down somewhere. The biggest one, I think, for this one is that human beings change. And everything you're doing is building who you are. So it's not like a diamond that is going to be the same way that it is for I think, hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. But that worked well enough for me to start focusing on who I am, what I like about myself, what's important to me, and acting accordingly rather than relying on what other people said about me, what other people thought about me, how other people treated me. As Nathaniel Branden put it, if someone I like does not return my feeling, it may be disappointing or even painful, and it may be. But it is not a reflection on my personal worth. And that was the belief I had to eventually come to accept, and have now come to accept, to really start to value myself appropriately. And that takes different forms, of course, with different people, but it's often the way of, depending on, for example, your parents being proud of you, or having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or having a big group of friends. Not that these things are inherently bad, but just that if that's what you're looking at to tell you that you're worthy, you're not actually using your own standards. You're not trusting the conclusions that you've come to through your own thinking. Another common example that's exemplified by Donald Trump here. It's funny, go ahead. A lot of people feel the need to tell others that they are better than they are. Donald Trump, there were so many quotes to pick from when I was choosing this, but I chose this one because it was particularly funny. I have a very good brain and I've said a lot of things. You know all the words, exactly. But Donald Trump exemplifies this attitude of, I'm going to tell everyone how great I am, and then I'll actually be great. But it doesn't work. Why? Because we all laughed at that, right? We all know that Donald Trump maybe isn't that smart, or at least he doesn't present himself as that smart. And what does it do when you're constantly trying to tell everybody that you're better than you are? Firstly, people can see right through you half the time, unless you're very, very smart. And, more importantly, for self-esteem, you're telling your subconscious that not only are you not actually that good, people won't accept you. You won't be able to get by. You won't be able to succeed if you're not this thing that you're pretending to be. So you're telling yourself, again, that you're not enough, that the way you are isn't okay. Another example that we sort of touched on, an error that I think people make a lot, is holding themselves to impossible standards. And this is particularly common, I think, among people who are high achievers, who are ambitious, who want to go out and do a lot in the world. I love the ambition, but sometimes, and I've also fallen prey to this myself, sometimes you think you can do more than you can, or you expect yourself to do more than you can. You expect yourself to know everything about a situation, even if there was actually really no way you could have known that. You expect yourself to be able to affect things that you couldn't have affected. And it's just setting yourself up to fail. If you expect yourself to know everything, then you're never going to be able to actually appreciate the level of knowledge you have, build on it where you need to, and hone in on the things that you do not know. The final mistake that I have a couple of examples of here is believing that you're doomed from the start. And this has more to do with your consciously held beliefs. But if you think that no matter what you do, you are bad, for whatever reason, then how are you ever going to think that you're worthy of success and happiness because you're bad, right? So one of the older examples of this is original sin, which you see in Christianity and some other religions. Because of Adam and Eve's disobedience, which you might argue wasn't even that bad to begin with, now all of humanity is composed of sinners, and we're all bad, right? So you're born bad, essentially, before you've even done anything. The more modern example is what you see with the anti-racist and the woke leftists. The people like Robin DiAngelo, who think that all white people are racist. And they've sold, unfortunately, millions of books convincing people of this fact. quote unquote. So again, if you think just because of the color of skin that you were born with, that you are somehow horribly bigoted, racist, morally bad, then how can you ever think that you're worthy of success and happiness if no matter what you do, you are bad? So as I said, there are loads of other ways that you can go wrong here, but those are some common ones that I think you can see how those start to cause problems here. So in conclusion, self-esteem is self-reinforcing, and it can be seen as a self-fulfilling prophecy. But you begin to rewrite it by accepting yourself. And this I didn't touch on enough, I think, during the presentation, but this means accepting the good and the bad parts of you. Because what some people who have bad self-esteem are doing is just looking past, finding ways to discount or discredit the good things that they've done. Yeah, but that doesn't really count because of, fill in the blank here. I got good grades in school, but that was just because school was easy, or because my teachers liked me. No, you got through school because you worked hard and you succeeded and because you're smart, right? So accepting yourself, being morally good by a rational standard, because otherwise we're setting ourselves up to fail, and taking responsibility for your choices and actions for your life. When you begin to do that, you can begin to build a seriously strong, fundamental sense of self-esteem. Thank you. I think we have plenty of time for questions. Eli.
So I meet a lot of people who credit a lot of their self-development to their romantic relationship, so that their partner has helped them grow. And I wonder if you think that a romantic relationship can be a useful tool to finding that I. And if so, how do you know when you're in that romantic relationship to grow, and when you're getting that support from your partner, and when it's external validation?
Good question. I think it's a very contextual question. But I think you have to have some level of I going into a relationship, otherwise you tend to self-sabotage, right? If you don't think that you're at least kind of good, at least kind of worthy going into a relationship, then you're going to maybe not treat that relationship with the importance it deserves and not give it the priority that it needs. Or maybe you may even lash out at your partner for things that aren't really that big of a deal and self-sabotage in that way. But I also think that it is the case that you can grow a lot with the right romantic partner, because that ends up being a person who knows you and who accepts you. If it's a healthy relationship, they know you and they accept you fully, but they're not letting you get away with things, if that makes sense. They're showing you where you could improve and doing it in a gentle and compassionate way. So in a sense, they're almost doing some of the things that I said you should be doing for yourself with you, if that makes sense. They're saying, well, really, this could have been better. Or why did you do that? I don't really understand. And hopefully they're doing this in a way that's gentle and loving, so that you're not starting to feel bad about yourself when things need to be improved. So, and I can also say from my current relationship, it pushes me, just nudges me a little bit outside of my comfort zone every so often, and that's helpful, because sometimes you just need the nudge, and once you're there, then you do fine. So. Melanie.
Yeah, thank you. So in your talk, you talked about accepting yourself, right? So first of all, I've known us to define two notions, and the first one is gender. Many people believe that gender is a social construct. And secondly, everything is a choice. Even if you decide not to do anything, that's a choice. So coming from that, a lot of people nowadays, we see that they tend to accept themselves as they are, or at least as they think they are. For example, maybe they are too fat, or maybe they belong to different sex, and they claim that they are the opposite gender. So my question is, what's the objectivistic view on these issues, and more specifically about body positive? So when you say you should accept yourself and not do anything accordingly, also not to take others' opinion or just expect their validation, right? So, for example, if I was born as a woman, but I claim that I'm a male, and I do not take others' opinion, others' validation, I just accept myself as such. So, do you think that's right, or no, and why?
So much to get into there. Okay, great question. Firstly, because it's a little bit easier, I think, role of external validation, one thing I didn't get to. There is a legitimate role for being happy when somebody you respect and admire praises you. And that is just, it's another data point. It's a sort of confirmation. You know, say you work really hard on a project at work, and then your boss tells you, hey, you did a really good job on this project. Let's say your boss is even a little bit more specific. He says, you know, I really enjoyed your attention to detail in that project, and that made it that much better. That's a specific thing that you know you do. You know, you have attention to detail, and now here's just somebody else confirming that. And that, I think, as long as you're not having that as the basis of your self-esteem, it can help just kind of bump it up a little bit, or just support it as it is. Yeah. Now, the same thing goes with constructive criticism. Hopefully, the people around you, particularly at work, but even in your personal relationships, will be willing to tell you when they think that you're not doing something correctly, or you're not doing things up to the standard that you could be. You're not working up to your highest potential. And hopefully they'll be able to help you with that to some degree, but maybe they won't. Maybe they'll just be, you know, tell you this is where you're at and this is where you should be, and, you know, kind of, you need to bridge that gap, right? So a lot of times when people have that kind of criticism, they can, and I have off and on, had that sort of negative response to it, but emotional response. But what you want to do is set aside the negative emotional response of I'm being criticized and just focus on, well, is this true? Because if it is true, then there's an area that I can grow, and a way in which I can grow, and a way, you know, if it's a factual error that's being corrected, a way I can have my mind be closer to reality, right? So feedback, in the words of my boss, is just information. And if you want to compare that information to reality, you can use it to grow, and it can really strengthen you if you are actually genuinely trying to improve. Now, on the issue of the gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it, there's the facts of reality, which is biological sex. You are born a certain way. As far as I understand, I would like to say also this is not the objectivist position, because the objectivist position, as we'll get into, is what Ayn Rand wrote, and as far as I know, she didn't write anything about this. Please feel free to correct me. But from the way I see it, the reality is biological sex. Those are things that you have to acknowledge, and if you're pretending they are other than they are, it's going to hurt you. And the most obvious way is physically and medically. If you are not, for example, telling your doctor that you were born as a woman, but now you look like a man, that's going to have significant impacts on how they treat you, because your hormones are going to be different, your physiology is going to be different. I don't know about the neuroscience side of it, but there are various aspects that need to be addressed there. And the same thing with the body positive thing. Accepting yourself means saying, I am the way that I am. It does not mean I should be this way. You may need to look at yourself and say, yeah, I'm bigger than I should be. And what the good part of, I think, the body positive movement is if you are overweight, for example, it does not mean that you do not have other good qualities. It does not mean that you cannot even be attractive. But, I mean, that's attractive in your own eyes. But that doesn't change the physical health aspect of it. And if you're trying to pretend that it's healthy to be overweight, it's not. And that's going to eventually have, even if it's not catastrophic effects on your health, you know, like a heart attack or something like that, it's going to just kind of hurt you a little bit every day. The people who are overweight, we know they're prone to way more diseases, we know they have lower energy, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just not supporting your life as well as it could be, because you're not being as attached to reality as you could be. So I think that covers most of what I need to say there. Yes?
So I think the first question, when you were speaking about experience about your partner who were making those comments about yourself, I get the audience, I feel okay with one. And I wanted to say that I also had the same experience, but I wanted to ask, like, in my case, it was like, in my career life, I wanted to show that I was smart, I was good, and it was affected like differently, but my personal appearance looking at it affected in a lowest. Like, I could change my career life, And like let's say healthy boundaries of this comment, we want to change, not change, but help our partner, for instance, in future. There is these boundaries of not being toxic and
Yeah. So yeah, I didn't touch too much on seeing yourself, I guess, in a physical way, because there's only so much you can do to affect your physical appearance unless you're willing to go and get plastic surgery, right? Like, there's maintaining a healthy weight, there's maintaining good hygiene, those things are good, and then there's dressing in a way that's flattering, and doing your hair and such in a way that you like. That's it. That's all there is. So I find it a lot more helpful, or I guess like, in my case personally, for example, I struggled with acne for a long time. Spent hundreds of dollars at dermatologists to get that cleared up. But take the steps you can take to fix what you're not happy with, and then, as long as you're a healthy weight, as long as you are having good hygiene, it is what it is, I think. On the second point about being, setting healthy boundaries and not being toxic in your future relationships, I think, for one, that's why you need to have a healthy self-esteem. Because if you have a healthy self-esteem, going into these other relationships, you don't need the other person to, be dumber so you can be smart, or any, it doesn't have to be about intelligence in any particular way. The other person is low achieving and you are the, CEO of your company, or something like that. You're not looking for that disparity. You're looking for somebody you can respect and admire. And if you're going into a relationship with somebody you respect and admire, you're already predisposed to treat them well because you respect and admire them. The other thing is just trying to be, I think, as rational and just in a relationship as possible. So you have to, and that means, a little bit controversial, but that means being just to yourself as well as to other people. So not accepting poor treatment when you don't deserve it. Like, if you do something wrong in a relationship, if you, you get snappy. Like, I have a tendency to get snappy when I'm hungry. So if you're a person like me who gets hangry, and every once in a while you snap at your partner because you're hungry, then you apologize and you say you didn't deserve that, and you move on. So being willing to apologize when you're wrong, knowing what your tendencies are so you can work around them, work to improve them, that sort of thing, I think is really helpful. And being just in looking at what they deserve and what they don't deserve and trying to act accordingly. Because, again, if you're in a relationship with somebody you respect and admire, they deserve to be treated well. And you want to get as close to that as possible. So, that helps. Yes?
I also have a question about self-improvement. You mentioned that if we accept ourselves in the way that we don't deserve, we will never get better and we will stuck down there. And to improve ourselves, we need to lead to self-expectance, and this also includes self-criticism partially, because you need to see the things you are not good at or you don't like. But if we criticize ourselves too much and become obsessive, we also hurt ourselves. I want to ask, where do we know how to stop and where to stop? Because, where do we know that we are not settling down from where we deserve? How do we know? If we just pushed a bit harder, we would be at a better place. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so that's a bit of a personal question for me as well. But how do we know we are at where we are deserving?
Yeah, great question. So I would say on the subject of self-criticism, what we're going for is honesty and being connected to reality. What we're not going for is dwelling on anything unnecessarily. One point I ended up cutting from the presentation, but I'll make it now. You are judge and jury, essentially, in your own mind, of your character. But what you don't want to become is the prosecutor. You don't want to be only looking for the bad things and trying to see how bad it is. You want to be looking at all of the evidence and weighing it accordingly. And as I said as well, when there is something that's maybe not great about your character, or you've done something that's not great, your goal is not to dwell on that, not to spend ages just feeling bad, but to figure out why you did the thing. Can you fix it? Do you need to apologize to somebody perhaps, or do you need to learn a new skill or set a new procedure in place so that you would stop making you won't make those mistakes in the future? And then you move on, and that's it. If it's something that's coming up repeatedly, if it's not just like a one-time mistake, but something you tend to do a lot, then you need to have more questions, more thoughts about why that's happening repeatedly. And if there's, more often than not, there's something underlying it that you need to sort out and work out. And again, I'm focusing a lot on like the internal things here that affect your self-esteem. If you have trauma at a really young age or something very horrible, even if it's not at a young age, if something horrible happens to you, you may need a psychologist to help you with these things, because there are some factors that can just really impact you that you don't really have too much control over. So, and that's another thing, is don't criticize yourself for things that you don't have control over. In terms of when do you know that you're where you want to be, I think you have to put things in perspective in terms of how important to you are they. So your moral character should be extremely important to you. But if you're learning to play guitar, right? Like my husband takes guitar lessons. He only practices a couple times a week because he likes the guitar, but it's not the most important thing in his life. So, you know, if he spent a lot more time on the guitar, he could probably be a rock star, but that's not what he's chosen to do with his life. So keeping things in perspective, and you know, whether you push that extra little bit to perfect it depends on how important it is to you and what is the marginal cost, to put it in economic terms, of pushing that extra 1%, 2%, whatever it is.
Please give it up for Adrian.